Okay, so thank you all for coming. It has been over these past 6 months. The Jordan Center, by the way, welcome to the Jordan Center. The Jordan Center has been keeping alive online like the rest of us. And I, for one, am just so happy every time I'm at an event and see real life people who are interested in vaguely some of the same things that I am, and it really gives us a sense that there's still a community out there. So. I'm just so appreciative to see you all. The Jordan Center, as I've indicated, as always, has loads and loads of events. And now, weirdly, now that it's online, and we are really more available to a wider group of people than we would be otherwise, which is really rather nice. So you can go to the Jordan Center website to see all the upcoming events. You can get on the email list. I get 3 copies of every email. I don't know about the rest of you, and hear what's coming up. The next lecture is going to be by Fabrizio Fenghi from Brown University on October 6th. Is that correct, Sasha?
That's right.
On October 6th. So this is based on his new book. It will be fun and terrifying, about the National Bolshevik, I suppose we call it right wing in Russia, particularly focusing on Eduard Limonov and Alexander Dugin. This is really fascinating stuff. I read the whole book. I loved it so much I blurbed it. And I can't recommend that one enough. I would also highly recommend today's lecture, but you're here, so there's really no point because I don't need to convince you. So instead, I want to introduce Maria Vinogradova, who's a visiting assistant professor at Pratt Institute and an adjunct assistant professor at the Feirstein Graduate School of Cinema and Brooklyn College, CUNY. She's a film and media historian specializing in the study of Soviet film culture, in particular nonfiction and amateur films, their creation, distribution, circulation, and afterlives in post-celluloid era. She's currently working on a book manuscript based on her doctoral dissertation, defended with distinction at New York University's Department of Cinema Studies on the Soviet culture of amateur filmmaking in 1957-1991. And I'm so happy to hear her give this talk, in part because I know that her work quite well. I was on her dissertation committee, and she wrote and defended a fantastic dissertation, and I can't wait to see the book. And I'm really excited to hear her talk today. So let's all welcome Maria. And Maria, you should unmute yourself.
Yes, I've just done it. Thank you very much for this generous introduction, Elliot. I am very happy to finally have a chance to give this talk, which had to get postponed a couple of times during the spring and finally carried over into the new academic year. So Elliot, in his introduction, has explained in part where my topic comes from, and I will explain some more. So I spent much of the last 10 years researching the history of amateur filmmaking in the Soviet Union, and in particular the shape it took after 1957, when, due to advocacy of film professionals in the newly founded Union of Filmmakers, amateurs were provided with material support and infrastructure for making their films. And that was also the time when there emerged a very interesting and diverse culture of non-theatrical filmmaking. And my interest in amateur films is informed by the branch of film studies that approaches the subject through the framework of the history of uses of film media. Creation of the more familiar feature-length theatrical films that hopefully we will watch again someday. So those films present one such use of the medium, but there have been many more. Film amateurs in my project are not only those who make home movies documenting their family, but more broadly, those who incorporate cameras in their daily activities. Scientists, engineers, factory workers, dancers, travelers on exploration and leisure. The list is very long. And this is a good moment to start showing some of my slides. Oh, I have to share the screen first, of course. All right, so in the course of this research, I was struck by the recurrence of the metaphor of a camera as a gun. And first of all, in the 1960s literature that promoted the idea with hunting with a camera, that is a still or motion picture. as both an alternative to hunting as a violent sport and as a recreational use of camera that was more goal-oriented. Replacing violence with observation, it promoted observation as surveillance, the results of which could be explosive. And later in my talk, I will connect film hunting with the genre of people's control films that developed in the 1960s and 70s. And I have to say that one of the challenges of giving the talk via Zoom is that clips are quite difficult to show because they might appear quite pixelated. I will explain a lot of films through stills, but closer towards the end of my talk, I will also try to show some clips. Hopefully, technology will allow us to do this. And in the beginning, I will talk about the metaphor of cameras and guns more broadly. This metaphor has been recurrent through the whole history of the moving images. So we see it in Eisenstein's films of the 1920s. Dziga Vertov wrote about camera as a gun and also a camera fist, which supposedly was a way of delivering a message that that would strike as a fist. And then this history is, of course, not restricted to the Soviet Union. So, for instance, we see it a lot in third cinema in the 1960s. Latin American directors such as Fernando Solanas and Octavio Quintino, their films and writings as well are full of these comparisons. Now, camera guns predate cinema. Jules-Étienne Marais, the French experimenter, invented the device that he called le fusil photographique, or the camera gun. And this is one of the ancestors of the motion picture camera, introduced in 1882. This camera shot 12 frames per second. And Marais' fusil photographique was based on the photo revolver invented in 1874 by the French astronomer Jules Janssen. Marais was a doctor and he was interested in studying the body movement. Now, we find, Susan Sontag, in her seminal book on photography, likewise explores this metaphor. So in this book published in 1973, she wrote, like guns and cars, cameras are fantasy machines whose use is addictive. However, despite the extravagances of ordinary language and advertising, they are not lethal. Still, there is something predatory in the act of taking a picture. To photograph people is to violate them by seeing them as they never see themselves, by having knowledge of them they can never have. It turns people into objects that can be symbolically possessed. And one example of the kind of thinking about cameras and guns that Sontag expresses can be found, for instance, in the 1999 film by Elizabeth Barrett called Stranger with a Camera, that goes back to 1968 when the Canadian filmmaker Hugh O'Connor, whom you can see on the left, came to Western Kentucky to film the area and was shot by the local man Hobart Eisen. So Barrett asks in that film, what happens when a man with a camera encounters a man with a gun? So this is an ultimate kind of confrontation that really heightens this metaphor of a camera and a gun. And so let's look at this, at the parallels between the two of them a little bit more closely. So a gun shoots while the camera looks. The gun kills or injures while the camera records. So, and we can see that the metaphors between the camera and gun really revolve around these kinds of parallels. But actually, the gun is not the only analogy to the camera that has been explored through the history of film. For instance, we can remember the camera or camera pen or brush as theorized by Alexandre Astrud in France in 1947. So he argued for the act of filmmaking being similar to the more traditional writing. And continuing to explore also the connections, the language used to describe filmmaking, I will draw your attention one more time to the use of the word shot in cinema. So a frame or a number of frames portraying the same composition is called a cinema shot in English. So in French, for instance, this word is different. It's not shot, but it's cadre, which means frame. So frame or shot. One is more violent than the other, but both denote the different kinds of looking. And then again, going back to the Soviet film culture, filmmaker Alexander Medvedkin literally used cameras that looked like guns. So during World War II, he oversaw a brigade of wartime film correspondents sent to the front lines to document the war. And cameras were in scarce supply, in particular the 16mm cameras that he is using here. So the 16mm gauge is a lot more compact than the traditional professional 35mm camera. And while in the United States, the 16mm camera was introduced by Kodak in 1922, and non-professional filmmaking was developing rapidly in the 1930s. In the Soviet Union, it was mainly unknown. So a part of the history of, a part of the reason that my history of amateur filmmaking in the Soviet Union begins in 1957 is that it's the moment after which the domestic production of 16mm cameras began. So where did Medvedkin get this camera? He got them from planes supplied by the United States according to the Lend-Lease agreement. So those planes were equipped with cameras. So at his request, a few of them were detached, and then he took them to a factory where they put them on top of a machine gun handle. So, and it was a camera that was more portable, but it was also, during the war, it was performative as well. So it framed the act of filmmaking as more than documenting, but it was also a way to fight the war. So again, the cameras, both literal and film cameras, occur in the context of the war, but also, of course, hunting. And in this section, I will also go over the place of hunting in the Russian and Soviet culture. So one of the first owners of cameras in revolutionary Russia was Tsar Nicholas II, who was also an avid hunter. Now the Russian royal family was also very closely, at that point, was closely related to the British nobility and also the royal family, where hunting was likewise and important sport. So, and this this photograph again depicts the Tsar while hunting. So hunting again exists in a variety of contexts. One of them is hunting for subsistence. The other one is sport, and these two uses of hunting can be contradictory, because hunting as sport obviously can be viewed and has frequently been viewed as a waste of natural resources, as an unwise way to manage the nature. So by extension, wild animals throughout the history of human culture have been viewed in context such as a resource adjunct to land, but at the same time an enemy to be exterminated. So it was both a resource and a source of danger. But when they are hunted with a camera instead of a gun, they become an object to be observed, and that's what this idea promoted. Another very famous, I would say, iconic hunter in the Russian culture is the writer Ivan Turgenev, whose collection of short stories published in 1852 and titled A Sportsman's Sketches, Записки охотника, sometimes translated as Notes of a Hunter. So this collection of stories is based on his observations of peasant life and nature while hunting in the forests around his mother's estate of Spasskaya. And so in the Soviet canon of the 19th century culture, Turgenev occupied a special place. His short stories precluded the abolition of serfdom in Russia by almost a decade, and his intention to observe the peasants was viewed as a positive aspect in the Soviet culture, and Turgenev was often portrayed as a hunter. Another example from the world of literature, brilliantly examined by Catherine Reichel in her book on the use of cameras in the Russian literature. So Mikhail Prishvin, for him, the theme of human and nature was central to his work, and camera was an extension of this exploration. So he both wrote and also photographed. And Dziga Vertov, for instance, refers to Prishvin, calling his method being closest to his own. I quote, "Like myself, he feels that it's possible to come with pencil or brush in hand, as painters do, and also to investigate nature in your own way, obtaining not the reasons for phenomena, but their images. I come not with a brush, but with a camera, an instrument more perfect, and I want to penetrate nature for artistic purpose, to discover images, obtaining precious truths not on paper but on film, through observation and experiment. This is the union of newsreel, science, and art." So Vertov wrote this in 1939, and this is Prishvin with his Leica camera. One other hunter in the Soviet pantheon is Vladimir Lenin. So he appears as a hunter in newsreels and also some of the canonic paintings of the Leniniana, as it was called in the 1960s, portrayed him as a hunter. So these portrayals belong to the tradition that viewed hunting as something that happens in the background, whereas the process itself is meditative. It is a way to be one with nature and at the same time to reflect more broadly on things that the hunter observes on this trip. And oh, have I just muted myself?
Yes, you were just muted for a few seconds.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, Lenin's degree on hunting from 1920 actually aimed to control hunting. Again, recognizing it as a in terms of subsistence and aiming to prevent overhunting by through hunting as a sport. And once again, so this is a frame from some of the Lenin footage shot between 1918 and 1922 and put together on the same reel in the 60s. So the intertitle here says that his rare spare hours Vladimir Ilyich would spend hunting. So again, and that's an 8mm print of this is actually right now at NYU's Tenement Library. So this pictures are courtesy of NYU libraries. Again, one more Lenin on a hunt in 1964, as painted by Alexander Sakhanov. Here also together with a forest ranger, it appears enjoying a conversation, not really killing anyone, but the ritual of hunting is held to be very important. And this is, I think some of you might be familiar with this footage that has been circulating on YouTube for a couple of years now. So shot in 1964 during Nikita Khrushchev's visit to Moscow. So during Fidel Castro's visit to Moscow. So where would Khrushchev take Fidel? Of course, he would take him hunting. So again, a ritual that celebrated friendship and masculinity. And I will not play a clip from it, but it's quite easy to find on the internet. It's quite fascinating. So again, more on the idea of hunting with a camera instead of a gun. And I will illustrate the next part with this still from a book published in the 1960s by Mikhail Zaplatin with that very title, Hunting with a movie camera instead of a gun. So resonating with the new legislation on environment protection passed in 1960, the idea of film hunting stands at the intersection of environmentalist and pacifist impulses with nostalgia for the wartime heroism, while also cultivating the figure of urban explorer who was neither a professional scientist nor a rural dweller relying on hunting for subsistence. The figure of film hunter falls into the lineage of masculinist images of documentary cinematographers, from Dziga Vertov's Men with a Movie Camera to wartime operators trained from the ranks of the military personnel. Again, I am referring to Medvedkin's group here. Revival of the Soviet film industry in the mid-1950s brought with it a variety of efforts to diversify the range of uses of filmmaking, and resulted in particular in increasing public attention to educational and popular science film. Alongside scientists and naturalists who used cameras in their research, and professional cinematographers specializing in filming nature and wildlife, Film hunting was growing with the development of amateur filmmaking, propelled by introduction of domestically produced 16 and 8mm cameras, state sponsorship of dedicated amateur film collectives, and expansion of the material infrastructure for non-professional filmmaking. The ideology of film hunting is indicative of a variety of trends in the post-Stalin Soviet society. On the one hand, it signals greater acceptance of leisure and non-productive activities that came to be associated with personal development. Alongside hunting as a branch of economy, hunting as a sport was generally praised as a way to strengthen the body and spirit, explore the nature, and cultivate human resources for potential combat missions in the event of war. At the same time, with the growing awareness of environmental concerns, the necessity to kill animals for pleasure was increasingly questioned, while emphasis on rational management of resources in the knowledge-intensive socialist economy highlighted overkilling as a waste of resources. Film hunting thus appeared as a bloodless alternative, while still allowing to bring home a trophy in the form of moving images. And Zaplatin's book opens or mentions somewhere in the beginning, again, the new legislation of 1960 that limited recreational hunting. And in the 1960s and 70s, we see a whole series of books on the subject. For the most part, they focused on still photography, but most of them had some kind of reference to hunting in it. For instance, one was called Hunting as a Bloodless Sport, or shooting without killing. So this kind of titles, and that came earlier actually. So one of the notable appearances of the concept of hunting with a photo gun in the Soviet culture can be found in the animation film Evocation on Prostokvashino from 1980, based on stories by Eduard Uspensky. So this is a whole series that were popular with children and adults alike. In this film, the anthropomorphized dog Sharik comes to a village together with the rest of the film's characters and expresses an interest in hunting. Instead of a real gun, he eventually gets a photo gun as a gift and becomes an avid photo hunter. The metaphor of photo hunting became a popular subject of Soviet jokes after this film. The pleasure of these jokes apparently lies in a thin metaphor encapsulated in the act of photo hunting. It is harmless, but contains a hidden aggression that is not allowed to be released, suppressed by the norms of society and the individual's own taboos. The peculiarity of the situation with photo hunting is that it admits the existence of such aggressive impulses, but instead of suggesting ways to purge them out of the system, it offers a compromise that allows to have the best of both worlds. The danger that aggression poses to society is understood here in terms of physical damage. And as long as the possibility of the latter is eliminated, aggression can be tolerated. So unlike the dog Sharik, whose photo gun is designed to look like an actual gun, Zaplatin, in his book I mentioned earlier, only talks about a regular film camera. He carefully explains the ways in which nature can be enjoyed with observation, promising rewards potentially more valuable than gains and thrills of traditional hunting. The book is a mixture of suggestions for appreciation of nature and practical advice, including exposure, frame composition, optics, and filters. The concept of kino hunting is symptomatic of the change in attitudes that occurred in the 1960s. In the spirit of the time, it encourages active leisure in the nature, but it also admits a greater degree of play in such escapes. The book encourages observation as a way to learn about nature, but also embraces a fantasy of leisurely hunting, traditionally the domain of the bourgeois. These are not hunters who labor in tough conditions of subarctic wilderness for the good of the nation, but lonely individualists who pursue their own interests. Most discussions of amateur filmmaking stressed its social function and collective nature, whether it was within a factory collective or a family. In contrast, kino hunting is a lonely pursuit. And the type of self-fashioning favored by the 60th generation of шестидесятники has been linked to a nostalgia for the masculine ideal of the frontovik, or a rough World War II soldier, as argued, among others, by Christian Nock. A transitional figure between such a soldier and a film amateur would be a military camera from Medvedkin's team that I have mentioned. Kino hunting appears to play with this type of masculinity, but it is an activity adapted to the time of peace. And one figure is especially important to the late Soviet concept of hunting with a camera instead of a gun is the filmmaker Boris Dolin, who worked in popular science, and his specialization were films about nature and especially animals, and many of them specifically were aimed for children. So after Dolin's passing, Centre Nauch Film, the central studio for popular science films, released in 1980 a film named Hunting Without a Shot, again based on Dolin's own earlier film. And the film also explores this idea, and I would like now to play one clip from it, which shows how Dolin presented the fascination of hunting with a camera. Okay, I'm not sure what these arrows are that I'm seeing right now.
Иди! Борис Генрихович мечтал о тех временах, когда охотиться будут не с ружьем, а с фотоаппаратом. Когда человек станет не убийцей животного, а его другом.
Those active in the 1960s and 70s frequently mentioned their attempts to work in this genre, and it the idea emulates the popular Fitil series. It was a series of satirical shorts with elements of journalist investigation, first on film and then as a television program initiated by the famous writer Sergei Mikhalkov. Adhering to the genre of investigative journalism, Fitil exposed negative social events such as corrupt bureaucracy, bribery, and разгильдяйство, which should be translated as slovenliness or neglect. Due to the popularity of the series, the word Fitil subsequently came to denote a genre, including films made outside of the program. Interviewed in 2005, Mikhalkov compared each episode of Fitil to, attention, a gunshot, stating that each shot episode of Fitil was 100% a sniper shot. In less than a year, Fitil film crews became the most undesired guests wherever lawlessness was occurring. Auditors and inspectors were feared less than people with a film camera who appeared harmless at first. Here, Mikhalkov makes a reference to the common metaphor of camera as a gun, once again. In amateur film practice, Fitil and especially its close relative People's Control film are linked directly to the policy began by Khrushchev and continued by Brezhnev towards reviving public participation in governance. In 1962, Khrushchev's Party State Control Committee, or GPK, was created specifically for this purpose, subsequently transformed under Brezhnev into the Committee for People's Control in 1965. While Stalin's early inspectors were paid employees, the new organization relied on volunteers who were called upon to identify and expose violations by managers, officials, and bureaucratic administration. Jan Adams regards it as one of the schools of communism in which, I quote, participants practice and internalize the official norms of Soviet society, or put another way, where the voluntary compliance of the public is achieved through socialization, end quote. Such a school of communism has a predecessor in the form of the worker correspondent movement developed in the 1920s, in which rabkhory and photokory, so worker correspondents and photo correspondents, were encouraged to expose cases of incivility and delinquency. As one example, a 1926 article in Sovetskaya Photo argued for the power of photography to produce images that would discourage such behavior. Again, the idea of making the enemy visible is central to Fitil as well as its amateur version, the People's Control film. And an excerpt from the 1969 book, I Am a Film Amateur, demonstrates the extent to which these traditions were alive in the post-Stalin culture of amateur filmmaking. So just as Mikhalkov in his characterization of Fitil, this book compares cameras to guns. And yet, did film amateurs working in the genre of people control have the same power? So I would like to show a clip from the film with the same title as the book called I Am a Film Amateur. It's a documentary about 60 minutes long, made by the Central Popular Science Film Studio in 1964. And I see that the drawings are back, but I will continue regardless. So here's, again, this clip shows the ways in which amateurs making people's control films interact with professionals using this type of filmmaking as a way to argue amateur filmmaking is not useless after all.
Кинолюбительство – большая общественная сила. Ярославской областной партийной организации горячо поддерживает кинолюбителей, верных помощников партии, и в пропаганде достижений, и в борьбе с недостатками. Сегодня они пришли в обком партии с очередным выпуском своего комсомольского прожектора. Это съемки сегодняшнего дня на территории, на территории завода «Пролетарская свобода». Короткое интервью у директора завода Анатолия Федоровича Делунова.
Мне надо разобраться. Я первый раз вижу по скоплению под снегом, очевидно, тут товарищи, значит, специально члены прожектора занимались и обнаружили. Я не знал этого. Если бы они мне сказали несколько раньше, так я бы, может быть, сразу же принял меры.
Тут, как говорится, комментарии излишни. А что скажут работники, непосредственно ведущие этим вопросом? Слово начальнику отдела снабжения Виктору Григорьевичу Бушуеву.
Видите, такое получилось неприглядно. Так, как правило, они у нас обметаются ежедневно, ежедневно обметаются. И покрывается бумагой. Она, конечно, при ветрах, она срывается. И вот это, конечно, после выпада снегопада, вот такая картинка, которую здесь я вижу. Значит, еще товарищи не успели тут смести все. Знаете, утром это попали рано сюда.
Нет, не рано, товарищ Бушуев, а слишком поздно заглянули мы в ваше владение. Сегодня во многих городах луч комсомольского кинопрожектора выводит на свет бюрократов, рогателов, восхитителей народного добра. На эту тему у кинолюбителей был интересный разговор с главным редактором «Фитиля» Сергеем Михалковым.
Мы в своей работе сейчас опираемся главным образом на те факты, которые нам рекомендуют комитеты партийного и государственного контроля. Ну, и мне кажется, что это в равной степени может распространиться и на кинолюбителей. Кинолюбитель, он иногда просто открывает заново все и для себя, и для людей.
Сергей Владимирович, вот у нас у кинолюбителей подается такой вопрос. Как вы считаете, поднимется ли роль кинолюбительства, если вот в журнале сатирическом «Фитиль» сделать целиком из кинолюбительских сюжетов?
Мне кажется, что это было бы замечательно, если бы только вы сделали действительно 3-4 сатирических сюжета, обязательно цветные и обязательно на той пленке, которая нам нужна.
Нужная – это широкая пленка. Но ведь кинолюбители снимают на узкой 8 и 16 миллиметровой пленке. И это правильно. А цвет, он у них и есть.
So, film amateur here is treated as a younger brother of the professional making Fitil. Will tolerate his playing, as if to say, will tolerate his playing with a camera and may even include his material into our program to make him happy. But alas, he's working as amateur on 16mm black and white film. The documentary is criticizing this approach, making their own people's control of sorts, arguing that amateur films are not as primitive as most professionals tend to think. And well, I have not been able to find a lot of people's control films made by amateurs through my research. It is evident that the idea to use amateur cameras to police irresponsible fellow citizens and bureaucrats was quite widespread. Thus, it became the subject of the professionally made feature-length comedy Zudov, You Are Fired.
Кинолюбительство.
From 1984, directed by Boris Bushmilov. In this film, projectionist Nikita Zudov, working at a house of culture in a small provincial town, makes short films exposing misbehaviors of fellow citizens. From local drunkards to the director of a collective farm caught fishing under the sign that says "No fishing." As you can see here. He shows selections of these before the main feature, to the surprise and embarrassment of his film's subjects and dismay of his boss, who believes authorities should not be exposed in a negative light. Shy, insecure, and innocent to the point of being naive, Zudov is the opposite of filmmaker policeman envisioned by the likes of Vertov and Medvedkin. He's a holy fool rather than prosecutor, and much of the film's comic effect relies on his decisive lack of masculinity. Fragile in appearance, he's cheated out of his money by a black market dealer who promises him a Bolex camera. Zudov gets yelled at by his wife and infantilized by his own son, a 10-year-old who constantly makes suggestions regarding what and how to film. His movies are met positively by a local administrator overseeing an amateur film competition, but Zudov refuses to send them there, saying he needs to wait another 2 years to develop his skills. Tensions built with unhappy neighbors exposed in his films. His boss fires him. The resolution comes unexpectedly as a deus ex machina at another gathering at the House of Culture. In the film, it appears as though everyone in town attends each screening. At another gathering, it is announced that Nikita Zudov has won a prize at the amateur competition where he never sent his films. It turns out that another local film amateur, much older and more experienced, made copies and allowed himself to do this, as he humbly expresses it. Remarkably, the role of this amateur is played by none other than Leonid Obolensky, a legendary actor, director, and sound engineer whose film career began shortly after the revolution. During World War II, Obolensky was captured by the Germans and agreed to be Hilfswilliger, working for a small remuneration and having greater freedom of movement than other prisoners of war. Eventually, he escaped, but was prosecuted by the Soviet government after the war. Banned from living in major cities, he settled in Myas in Chelyabinsk Oblast, where he lived from 1972 until his death in 1991. There he became the director of a local amateur film studio at the House of Culture Prometei, which under his guidance became one of the strongest of such collectives nationwide. And so in Zudov, You Are Fired, Obolensky is cast in a cameo role, as you can see here, suggesting connections with his real life experience. He plays a respectable, influential figure that helps to validate Zudov's amateur pursuits for the town. His sad look suggests that his films lack vitality compared to Zudov's sharp work. His star does look like Hanna Shigula, though, so the woman in the image on the bottom, which is not very surprising in 1984. If Zudov's fellow citizens are not enthusiastic about having a camera policeman or camera prosecutor living among them, then they share in the pride of having a competition winner that makes his activities appear in a positive light. In other words, people's creativity is more palatable than people's control, in much the same way as in the film I'm a Film Amateur discussed earlier. Symbolically, at one point in Zudov, You're Fired, the protagonist attempts to sell his gun to buy a camera. If each issue of the Fitil was a 100% sniper shot, as Sergei Mikhalkov had put it, then amateurs' ability to be camera snipers were questioned by professionals. If we associate professionals with state power, then the state appears reluctant to share its monopoly on violence, even in the form of camera violence with amateurs. However, straightforward, people's control films were not the only way in which Soviet amateurs engaged social problems, and we can find elements of the genre in many other amateur films, such as this one, titled You Are Our Conscience, Mommy, from 1980, made by People's Film Studio Symbol in the town of Ulyanovka in central Ukraine. It deals with the issue of children abandoned by their mothers in birth clinics. At the same time, it sings an ode to motherhood, highlighting its pleasure and sacrifice. You Are Our Conscience, Mommy contrasts two mothers. One, anxious and purposeless, writes an official statement in which she relinquishes her parental rights. Another, a simple but dignified working-class woman, is not only raising her own children, but also adopts a few children from an orphanage. The film presents a distinctly Marxist view of motherhood as labor. If socialist labor is ennobling and gratifying by definition, here it is also not made to look easy. The good mother's situation is complicated by her eldest daughter's congenital disease. The daughter has grown up now, explains the voiceover narrator, but the mother continues to take care of her. And I quote, "Mother's work shift, materinskaya vakhta, continues to this day." Such vocabulary strengthens the labor metaphor. And as I mentioned a minute ago, the elements of people's control film also sneak in here. And I will show this 1 minute long clip that illustrates what I mean.
Немало в своей судьбе встретит он добрых людей. Они и пригреют его, и расскажут, отчего облако белое, а флаг красный. Но кто сможет объяснить ему, почему мать отказалась от него? Многим мы хотели задать этот вопрос, но, увы, при виде камеры они или убегали прочь, или держали нас на расстоянии, прячась и отворачиваясь. Вот как это. Это. Для того, чтобы укрепиться духом, чтобы вернуть поколебавшуюся было веру в истинный, высокий и чистый смысл материнского звания, заглянем к Екатерине Ивановне Русавской.
So that's the good mother I mentioned. And discussing why some women abandon their children, the narrator states that all attempts to interview such women on camera were met with resistance. They hide, leaving the question unanswered. To make it more specific, the filmmaker's camera singles out women and groups of people in the town's street, identifying those who refuse to provide explanations, truants and absentees that fail to comply with their motherhood duties. There is a disturbing quality to this film, appearing when it emerges then that the women shown in it are actual mothers. It first becomes clear from the way in which women caught in the street are filmed from a distance, probably with a hidden camera. It then also becomes clear that the mother shown in the clinic after she gave birth is likewise not acting, and she is filmed openly as she tries to look away from the camera. At one moment, she is shown in her hospital bed, lying silently on her side and facing the wall. The infant is brought and put forcibly next to her on her pillow, as if to revive her maternal instinct. Hospital staff refused to believe she made her decision in full consciousness. However, the insider perspective on the clinic and the orphanage suggests that the film was initiated by social workers employed in them, driven by the best motivations to make offenders change their ways. Fathers are nowhere to be seen in this film, and its use of a female narrator completes the image of the world in which women are solving the dilemmas of motherhood in the women's universe. Now, I am close to the end, but I have one more 2-minute long clip to show. Is that a yes? I do realize we've been running for a long time. Thank you. Okay. And this is by another Ukrainian film studio called DGI Юность of Dnipropetrovsk Mining Institute. So the film's title is Больно, or It Hurts. It's made in 1968 in response to a violent murder of one of the institute's students. This 5-minute experimental fiction film does not reveal the event to which it is dedicated until the very end. So right now I will show the 2-minute clip and discuss it briefly.
Стой! Не узнаешь?
Нет.
Я пришел убить тебя.
Что?
Да, убить. В лагере я много думал, что ты меня трепал судом о доброте, о вере в людей, и понял, что тебя надо убить.
Зачем?
Потому что я не хочу, чтобы кто-то делал людей добрыми. Не получится. Я убью тебя.
Но ты не сделаешь этого. Тебе помешают. Вокруг люди.
Кто этот? Этот не помешает. Понимаешь, мальчик, люди злые, им плевать на тебя, а на других. Каждый живет только для себя, никому до тебя нет дела. На!
Ой. Больно. Больно. Не надо, милый, не ходи.
Кто? Этот? Этот не помешает. Этот не помешает. Этот не помешает. 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 Не мешает. Нет.
The film dissects the indifference of strangers to which the young man falls victim. Is it cowardice, or is it unwillingness to take charge in the hope that someone else will do it, or simple laziness? All these possibilities are given equal chances in a sequence with patterns of overlapping editing. Although this focus on faces and people's motivations appears as a citation of Mikhail Rom's famous film Ordinary Fascism of 1960, I'm sorry, altogether this focus on faces and people's motivations appears as a citation of Mikhail Rom's famous film Ordinary Fascism from 1965. This found footage film used German newsreel footage from the Third Reich period in an attempt to comprehend the phenomenon of fascism. But rather than making the enemy invisible, as in classical police cinema described by Christina Vatulescu, the film suggests that it is indifference that killed the young student. And so the film enacts the situation of indifference, but I argue that it can be extended to the idea of creating films as people's control genre, drawing this arc of weapon, of using camera as a weapon. And I will end here, and we'll be glad to take questions if there are any, or to discuss the material. I hope it was okay to follow with all the disruptions that we had. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. That was really wonderful. Oh, good. You've unshared the screen. Right. So at this point, we're happy to take any questions from anyone who might have them regarding the talk. You can either do the wave at me, raise your hand with a function on Zoom, or type in chat. Oh, I see someone, Maria Koskina, waving your hand, right? You need to unmute.
Hello. Fascinating talk. Thank you so much. And really helpful for thinking about my own research on environmental history. I have a comment and a couple of questions. I hope you can hear me well.
I hear you very well.
Thank you. I wonder if additionally we can expand on the metaphor of cameras and guns to camera traps, which definitely became popular much later, closer to the 90s worldwide. And I think this might even reinforce your argument on the use of hunting cameras for surveillance, because camera traps directly relate to criminology, meaning criminals were being caught on similar camera traps. And both camera traps for animals and criminals were developing sort of in tandem with like in zoology and criminology. And my two questions are, first one, I wonder if you can conceptualize amateur cinema as an example of Panopticon, considering that anyone can take up a camera and execute public surveillance and control. And the second question is, can the cameras potentially as actants capture wild animals as something disappearing and something rare, no longer existing in abundance? So not necessarily environmentally conscious, but rather sometimes unintentionally speaking to environmental degradation. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So camera traps, I actually have never heard of them. Is it something like camera enforced speed control?
They're usually, I think, I'm not a specialist, of course, but in my studies of nature reserves and zapovedniki, we see camera traps that are usually having infrared detectors. And whenever an animal approaches the camera, it becomes active and takes a picture of an animal. So it's very different in the way that there is no person involved. At the same time, we have the same artifact that comes out in the end, something you can take with you and sort of make your property, which speaks to the theories that you mentioned by Sontag, I think.
Thank you for the suggestion. I'll definitely look them up. But that only shows how varied the uses of cameras and the film medium have been. I decided not to talk about, you know, this film projection used to practice shooting, for instance, and that I think it existed at least since the 1930s, and many types of training of this kind. So that's definitely a very broad topic. So going to your question on Panopticon, the idea that anyone can execute control, I would say this was a possibility, but probably not the most exciting use of the camera to those who wanted to make film as amateurs. In my experience, so again, why the framework of the history of uses of the medium is productive here is that a lot of people who made films in the first place just wanted to play with the camera, but then they also wanted to make it useful in some way. They wanted to create some kind of finished product. And of course, there were also home movies that were not edited, that were just footage, but members of clubs really wanted to make films, but they also suspected that they perhaps would not be valuable in the same way as professional theatrical productions. So they were looking for their identity. What is it that they could do? And so the idea of hunting with a camera instead of a gun was one. People's control film was another. Now, how many people were actually sensitive to, you know, it looked like a possibility of exercising democratic control over the government, and especially factory managers, as well as misbehaved fellow citizens. How many people were aware that it was also not necessarily the most humane way to treat those around them. I haven't seen mentionings of that, and overall, I have to say that films made in this way are hard to come by. But it really struck me that a lot of films that technically were not people's control used the idea of surveillance to say something about people who would not necessarily be willing to cooperate, like the Ukrainian film about bad mothers, for instance. I hope that answers your question. And capture wild animals as something rare and disappearing. I think for naturalists, that could be one of the things that allow them to view their filmmaking as useful and purposeful. So definitely we can rule that out.
Okay, great. We have a question in the chat from Tanya Goldman. Maria, thank you for a great talk. It's always a pleasure to hear about your research. You mentioned the 8mm print of the Lenin footage at NYU Tamiment. I'm curious if you can tell us more about other related film holdings at NYU libraries. Does NYU libraries have any amateur Soviet films in its collection?
Good question. I'm trying to understand because right now there are some finding aids that Tamiment has posted on its website, and it has about 400 motion pictures in its collection that comes from the former film library of the United States Communist Party, and for the most part those films came from the Soviet Union, although some came from Vietnam and Cuba. And so according to the descriptions I saw, some of them were Soviet films on 8mm. Now one of them is the Lenin film, so 8mm was a distribution copy and not an amateur film. But it's possible that there are Soviet amateur films there indeed. And there is one very fascinating discovery that we made last year is an amateur film from 1935 made by an American traveler in the Soviet Union, in Moscow, Leningrad, and Tbilisi. And I think I almost know who that was. I suspect it was Jules Bucker, who assisted Julian Bryan on his travels. So again, it's not a film made by a Soviet amateur filmmaker, but it is an amateur film in the collection. So there is lots to explore there.
Okay, great. Other questions? Oh yes, I see a hand raised. Raymond, you need to unmute.
Sure. Thank you for the talk. So I'm working on a dissertation project about animals in Russian and Soviet film. And I'm wondering if you came across any zoo films. So I'm thinking of like Frederick Weissman. I mean, it's much later, but like 93, he has a famous sort of like amateur-ish documentary. And then there's, I think there's a Dutch film, I think Hanstra, I think is his last name. He has a 1961 film just called Zoo. And like, I'm wondering, I don't know, was the zoo a site of amateur filmmaking in the Soviet Union?
I would like to know, I'm sure some home movies at least were shot in zoos. I personally have never encountered them. But in overall, animals in Soviet film is a very fascinating subject, so I'm glad you're doing it. I know some work on filmmaking in the zoos outside of the Soviet context by scholars like Catherine Brew. I don't know, maybe you've come across it, but I have never seen Soviet amateur films made in zoos.
Great. Are there other questions? Yeah, so before the question, Bruce, before I go to you, I have to go, but Sasha is going to take over managing the question and answer. Maria, this was fantastic. I'm sorry I have to go pick up my son, but this is great.
Thank you so much, Elliot.
And I leave this all in Sasha's capable hands.
Bruce, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Bye, Elliot.
Thank you, Elliot, and thank you, Maria, for a great talk. I'm so sorry it was strangely taken over by child's finger painting, because it was super well organized, and I think you were really thorough in covering it from lots of different angles. And I guess if I had a simple question, I really love the topic, and the question is just, you give us all the. I guess my question is why. Right? Why do you think this is the case? I mean, is it, you know, there's many ways to answer that, but why does Russia stand out in this way? Do you think Russia stands out in this way with a sense of fotoakhota, you know, fotoakhota, and, you know, does it stand out from other traditions of visual culture, other national traditions of visual culture? And if so, do you think it says something about Russian culture, history, society in some way? I mean, I felt like you gave this wonderful, I'm not pushing for more per se, but it just seems to me that you take us to this great point of showing how well established this is in a Russian visual tradition of the post-war period and earlier, of course, how it overlaps with the literature. You give us an interdisciplinary purchase. All of this is terrifically professional. And so the macro picture to me is just, you know, do you think this is a Russian thing as a scholar of visual culture more comparatively? And if so, what, right? Why? I mean, yeah.
Thank you for the question. So definitely it's not exclusively a Russian or Soviet thing. So and I stressed earlier in my talk that this metaphor of cameras and guns appears in cinemas everywhere. So if it's a camera and gun, then why not hunting? And there is some work that has been done on similar uses of cameras outside of the Soviet Union. So one character there is Karl Ackly, for instance, who didn't just do naturalist photography, but he did use devices that were made to look like guns. And I can imagine that if you actually have, you know, a big telephoto lens, perhaps it's a good way to stabilize it if you just use a gun handle and put it on your shoulder as opposed to putting it on the tripod. So there is some technological rationale here as well. So it does exist, and I have a few examples of other research of this kind. Again, photographing and filmmaking on safaris. Theodore Roosevelt was one of the people who did that. But so right now I am not able to say if it was more widespread in the Soviet Union than anywhere else. I first became aware of it because of this publications in the 60s. So the films themselves are not so easy to find. But again, the idea of hunting with a camera has appeared in other contexts as well.
Any more questions from anyone? Okay, great. I think we can wrap up. I'm so sorry again, Maria, for the drawings, and definitely applaud your perseverance, and we'll make sure that that does not happen ever again. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being at the virtual Jordan Center, and look forward to seeing you at future events.